Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of Anchor Watch. I'm your host, Bobby Jones, and we have the distinct pleasure of talking to a man whose experience as a correspondent and as a military veteran gives him a unique perspective on what's going on in Ukraine. You may have not noticed, but the war in Ukraine has kind of fallen to the wayside in mainstream media. Well, here at Lincoln Square, we're going to give you ground truth from people who are there and who have the experience to understand what they're seeing. I want to introduce everyone to Mr. Tim Mack, who is the author of the Counteroffensive Substack. You should definitely subscribe to that. And here was the conversation that we had very recently on the latest developments in Ukraine and how it relates to United States and American citizens going through the Trump administration now. So, Tim, you have a unbelievable background. I just want to briefly touch on that so people understand that you have a very unique perspective on what you're seeing happening, right? So, could you just delve a little bit into your background and how you wound up in Ukraine?
Sure. So I have a bit of a mixed background. I spent most of my professional career as a journalist in Washington, D.C. So I worked for major news organizations like Politico, like the Daily Beast, like NPR. And I also have a military background. I was a U.S. Army medic for 5 years, and did that on the reserve side while I was a correspondent at NPR. So in 2022, NPR sent me to Kiev in case a war might break out. And as it happened, I landed the night the war broke out. And I've been running around here ever since. Basically, traveled to every corner of Ukraine, and then decided I want to keep covering this war and find some new interesting ways to cover this place. And so in 2023, I launched the Counteroffensive, which is a Substack that covers the war not from the perspective of, hey, this happened, or the Frontline moved from this village you haven't heard of to another village you haven't heard of. And it shifted the kind of journalism we do towards narrative journalism, personal stories. So we tell you about the news in terms of profiling people who are living through it. And what we hope to do with that is tell really interesting personal narratives that make it easier to relate and understand what's happening here during the war. We would never just tell you, hey, some politician said something or some politician did something. We'd bring you to the ground level of people who are experiencing the consequences of the war and the consequences of American failure to support Ukraine. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that in this conversation. I also have a second publication which covers Ukrainian defense technology and the latest battlefield innovation. That's a trade publication, a technical publication called Counteroffensive Pro. And what we do there is we cover the latest battlefield innovations for an English-speaking audience.
Wow. So that's a lot to digest. So you have been there for the duration of this war. You have a military background, so you understand tactics, strategies. And from that medic standpoint, too, you understand casualties, the triaging that happens during conflict, as well as now covering the technological innovations, which I think are criminally underreported for what Ukraine has been doing to still be here. If people remember correctly, when the invasion occurred, experts were like, oh, this is going to be a 6-week war, et cetera, et cetera. But Ukraine is not only still here, they are launching counteroffensives and counterpunching. Let me ask you this. Ukraine, the spirit of the people is undeniable. The world has now fully recognized that. But what have you seen from the tactical, from the innovation, from the technology standpoint, kind of going into what counter offensive pro? What have you seen that has been truly innovative that the world is noticing, or strategists around the world are noticing?
Yeah, well, so I think you start with this idea that necessity is the mother of invention, right? Mm-hmm. That if you're pushed up against the wall and you're like Ukraine, outmanned, outgunned against a country with a much larger economy, with more people to throw into the fight, you've got to find ways to have an asymmetric counterpunch, like you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
You got to find ways to defend yourself with what little you have. And what the Ukrainians were able to do is to find good enough technology, call it cheap tech, call it stuff that is just relatively simple and relatively cost efficient, and use technology and innovate new ways and new software to apply that to the battlefield. So one thing that we've seen the rise of FPV drones, this first-person view drones that are essentially, in many ways, replacing artillery on the battlefield. Right. So instead of firing artillery barrages, what you can do is you can have a single Ukrainian drone pilot steer what is essentially an artillery round right around a corner, up above a building, down through the alleyway, and into the room where the commander of a battalion is having a meeting. That really changes the nature of the battlefield. Changes whether it's safe to congregate large groups of people together. It changes the economics of warfare. That if you have a $1,500 drone that can destroy a $3 million armored vehicle, suddenly it makes a lot less sense to be building these armored vehicles in such high quantities. It makes a lot more sense to build a lot more of these drones. And so that's just one of the angles. I mean, I could talk about this until the cows come home. But obviously, the biggest innovation on the battlefield has been the use of cheap, highly reliable, easily manufactured, and destroyable. That is, these kamikaze drones that we've been hearing about. So they're one use and done. These kinds of drones are very much going to be a standard feature on any battlefield going forward. And they outcompete really expensive, complex American and Western hardware.
I was literally about to say that the simplicity of this defeating these complex weapons, the systems, many of them designed in defense, it's like the ultimate guided munition, right? But yet way cheaper, like you said, to produce, and it's fundamentally changing overall strategic vision moving forward. Along those lines, you mentioned something that I think is very key: the economics of warfare being shifted by these tactics, right? So what's been lost in the news over here is the dwindling, or support financially as far as weapons purchasing from the United States to Ukraine. Now, the European Union has stepped up and have tried to fill those gaps. But the amount of money that the United States is willing to spend in Ukraine's defense has definitely taken a nosedive since the Trump administration has taken over. You mentioned the necessity of their innovation, right? How have you seen, the EU and other nations try to step up, and how have you seen the effects of the United States and its lack of support playing out on the battlefield there?
Well, look, even as much as I am a real believer in the impact of drones on the battlefield and how it's changing the way we should think about warfare, there are some things that can't be replaced. I'm not saying, for example, we shouldn't build or have B-2 bombers in the American arsenal, right? That there is obviously still a very serious role for strategic bombing, as we've seen recently. There are extremely complicated stuff, really expensive stuff, that simply cannot be replicated using these forms of innovation. And that includes things like Patriot missile batteries, right, which are critical to shooting down hypersonic missiles that are targeting Ukrainian cities. One of the major concerns here in Kiev and across Ukraine is that with the pause in American military aid, or perhaps the cessation of American military aid, that a very dangerous situation is going to get considerably more dangerous for Ukrainian civilians. Because right now they're able to shoot down a lot of missiles headed for urban centers.
Right.
But I don't know when. No one speaks about, the exact stocks of, Ukrainian air defense assets. But At some point, Ukraine's going to run out of interceptors.
Right.
And at that time, we're just asking for tragedy, compounding tragedy, compounding tragedy.
Wow.
And you asked about the EU. Well, the EU is well-meaning. The EU, even if it has funds to spend, it lacks the military-industrial capacity to build the sorts of things that Ukraine needs. And so America has been this indispensable partner. One thing that's not really realized outside of the United States, I think that it's been poorly covered, is how betrayed Europe feels, not just Ukraine, but Europe and many alliances around the world about getting threatened or just having this sudden pullback of American leadership around the world. There are costs that are not just on the battlefield, even as severe as the battlefield costs are. And those are that when we're going to look around for friends in the future, we're going to find a very wary and suspicious group of Western democratic nations who wonder if we're setting them up for another rug pull.
Well, Tim, you hammered a point that I have been screaming at the top of my lungs. The abdication of leadership in organizations like NATO, for example, you cannot get that back. It took 80 years to build that trust. And the thing that kills me right now with the current administration, they're so transactional, yet they don't put the intrinsic value of bloodshed on the same battlefields as Americans. The only time Article 5 in the NATO Charter has been activated has been to support the United States. But yet we hold the NATO countries like, oh, you owe us this, you owe us that. No, you have member nations that have died helping Americans defend themselves. And the current administration does not understand that there's a value there. And I'm glad that you brought that up. The resiliency.
I agree, and I would even put an even finer point on it. It's not just merely that the Trump administration doesn't see the value in shared sacrifice. It sees the friendship and alliances and shared suffering as leverage.
Right.
Oh, we've done these things together. You owe us. There have been alliances over time. You've taken advantage of us. As if there were no reason over the last 80 years, we would have made those agreements.
Right.
No, these agreements were mutually beneficial.
Yes.
And the United States has thrown it all away. I think you hit the point that it takes a generation. It's like any personal relationship, really. It takes years to build trust, and you can lose it in an instant, and we've lost it.
Right. You couldn't phrase it any better. You're seeing the direct result of this, and you're seeing it real time. Let me pivot to the resiliency of the Ukrainian people. I mean, I have all sorts of apps from SitRep to this, that, and the other following what's happening in Ukraine. And it's heartbreaking to see the suffering, but they are still there. It's inspirational. And at the same time, I'm mad. I'm angry about it because I'm like, why is the world still not rallying about this? Right. So that being said, having a medic background, seeing all this, how are the people of Ukraine holding up? What do Americans need to know about this nation's citizenry that should inspire them, but more importantly, get on Congress to help support them? What do we not know?
I want to make a couple points, right? So as a medic, I'm familiar with this concept called the bystander effect, right? And the bystander effect is basically like the concept that most of us tell ourselves that if there was a child in a burning building, that we would rush in and try to save the child.
Right.
But in real world situations, the vast majority of us freeze. We realize we don't know what to do. We don't have the courage to risk our lives. We're afraid. And these are perfectly, they're not commendable reactions, but they're perfectly understandable reactions. What I've seen in Ukraine is people defying what has been a pretty broadly understood sociological concept, and having a majority of people say, I'm not going to put up with this current crisis. I'm going to do something about it. So people inventing things, people volunteering, people joining the military, people saying, it's not enough for me to sit back and watch the situation unfold. I'm going to do something about it. And that's been one of the reasons why I find myself residing here, is that I want to be among people who are like that, who are civic minded, who are purposeful, who are willing to risk their, not only their time, but their lives for a deep and meaningful cause. I find that, tremendously inspiring. All right. So there's, I want to put that in one of my two boxes. And my second box is like, I guess when I tell people I live in Ukraine, they think I must be dodging mortar rounds on the way to get a cup of coffee in the morning, right? And it's nothing so dramatic. The cost in Ukraine is the chronic cost, the physiological cost, at least to those, to the vast majority of people who are affected by the war, is the trauma that's experienced by everyone, but also the feeling of never being safe at any time. I want to really hammer home this point that, that in Ukraine, you never know when the next attack might be, and it could happen almost all the time. And so your body gets kind of worked up into this chronic state of anxiety and preparation for that next attack that's going to happen. Now, is that next attack likely to involve a Shahed kamikaze drone coming through my window in particular? It's probably not. But it's the not knowing, it's the anticipation, it's the lack of sleep. You know that sleep deprivation has been considered an instrument of torture. And it is no coincidence, I think, that the Russians are launching all sorts of attacks all throughout the night. People don't have any time to step back from their crisis and their stress and the war that they're involved in. And that leads to terrible physiological and psychological impacts over time. And this is to say nothing of the cost of the battlefield itself, from the torture and executions and the war crimes that have taken place, that the soldiers have been killed needlessly because Russia launched this invasion, to the people who come back without limbs and with PTSD from combat-related events. Everyone's affected, right? And their families, right? So that's what I would try to put. That's what I've been trying to spend a little bit more of my time writing about and having our team at the Counteroffensive write about. Everything from sleep disorders that are developing to the kinds of nightmares that people are experiencing. We really try to zoom in on the human and personal and ground level experience of what it's like to be in Ukraine and in other places where democracies are pushing back against authoritarianism. And that's our kind of entryway to do a different kind of news that that differentiates ourselves from the more staid and plain news that you might see in other news outlets.
Yeah, that's one of the things. And people, if you are on Substack or not on Substack, you need to subscribe to this. I'm doing it because it's the stories, the personal stories that you're telling. It's taking it from nation state conflict to how this is affecting individual lives, which I think has totally gotten lost in the shuffle. And it's important to tell those stories. And for what's going on here in the States, people may want to say, okay, well, what can we take from what's going on in Ukraine? The moral, mental, physical courage that you're seeing displayed daily that you just talked about is needed in mass dosage here in the United States right now, because you see it. I'm sure even the stuff you've seen, this tilt towards authoritarianism that's slowly happening here in the United States. The train has left the station, and it's going to take people that have that same mentality to stand up and have the courage to do something about it, whether it's in Congress, whether it's an American citizen just doing their daily lives. So I want to thank you for not just coming on, but doing what you're doing. We're going to make sure that we blast your Substack out on Lincoln Square so everybody can see it. It seems like your entire life has gotten you ready to do this job, this mission, to be honest. And I can't thank you enough. Is there anything finally that you want to tell everybody who's listening or who will see this?
Well, I think you put a pin right in the center of what we're trying to do, which is trying to cover news less like, these wars and these places are global chess pieces.
Mm-hmm.
The point of the counteroffensive is to show that these people's stories, their culture, their language, their cuisine, these are all valuable to cover in and of itself, and not merely as a product of war. And so that's why we've written about Romania and Georgia and Taiwan and Turkey and Syria. These are all places where all around the world, good people are pushing back against dictatorship. And I know that, as you were saying, Bobby, there are all sorts of concerns at home in the United States about what will happen there. Some of these stories we want to tell to show what the consequences of going down an authoritarian path are. There's nothing down there except for death and destruction and oppression. And it's not at all too late to do something about it. I think that one of the things that you've been able to do, and what Lincoln Square's been able to do so well, is to tell people, hey, this isn't just something you can get upset about and put down your phone. There's some real world issues at stake here. This isn't a NFL game where you cheer for one side and when you lose, you move on. There are active ways that you can be civically involved. You're a central part to the process. And this is not a spectator sport.
Right.
This is something that you're directly involved in. And
Absolutely.
that's what I hope that we can inspire people to think more deeply about. That we are all responsible for our share of this burden, that democracy is a shared responsibility if we can continue to fulfill our obligations.
Wow. And I think that's a very succinct way to put it. Anytime you want to come back on our show, on our network, we will be more than happy to facilitate that, number one. And number two, I just need to thank you for what you're doing. Stay safe over there, brother, and keep reporting. Keep telling the stories that need to be heard. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Tim Mack, it's been our honor to have him on. And please go to Counteroffensive and Counteroffensive Pro and subscribe on his Substack. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Bobby.